వీరు అమెరికా నివాసి, మేరీలాండ్లో ఉన్నారు. ఈయన ఒక సంస్థకి డైరెక్టర్, పైగా హిస్టోరియన్ కూడా. మన అందరికీ పరిచితమైనటువంటి సుపరిచితుడు పండిత కోట వెంకటాచలం గారు వారి యొక్క మనవడు వీరు. వారు రాసిన అనేక విషయాలు, గ్రంథాలు ఏవైతే ఉన్నాయో ఆ విషయాల మీద మనకి తెలియపరచడానికి ఈరోజు మనందరిలో ఈ కార్యక్రమంలో ఆయన పాల్గొంటున్నారు. తర్వాత శ్రీ వేదుల నరసింహ గారిని వేదిక మీదకి రావాల్సిందిగా కోరుతున్నాను. వేదుల నరసింహ గారు మన యొక్క ఈ సమితి, ఇతిహాస సంకలన సమితి తెలంగాణ ప్రాంతం ఏదైతుందో దానికి సంఘటనా మంత్రి, ఆర్గనైజింగ్ సెక్రటరీ అంటాం కదా, ఆ బాధ్యతని వారు నిర్వహిస్తున్నారు. వారు మన మధ్యన ఉన్నారు. ఈరోజు ఈ కార్యక్రమం దీప ప్రజ్వలనతో, మనం జ్యోతి ప్రజ్వలనతో మొదలవుతుంది. చెప్తానండి. ఓం శ్రీ 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 మహావిష్ణువాజ్ఞయ ప్రవర్తమానస్య అద్య బ్రహ్మణః ఇతిపరాదే శ్రీ శ్వేతవరః కల్పే సప్తమే వైవస్వత మన్వంతరే అష్టావింశతితమే మహాయుగే కలి ప్రథమచరణే పంచసహస్రాధిక ఏకశతాధికం ఏకాధికం సప్తమిశతమే కలియుగాబ్దే द्वाधिकं अशीतिविंशतितमे वैक्रमशके सप्तचत्वारिंशत् अधिकं एकोनविंशतितमे शकसंवत्सरे विश्वावसुनाम संवत्सरे चैत्रमासे कृष्णपक्षे वसंत ऋतौ चित्ता नक्षत्रे प्रतिपदातिथौ भानुवासरे जम्बूद्वीपे भरतवर्षे भरतखंडे पावनराष्ट्रे भारतदेशे दक्षिणक्षेत्रे तेलंगाणा प्रान्ते भाग्यनगरे नारायणगुडा परिसरे केशव स्मारक प्रांगणे स्वामी विवेकानंद सभागृहे वयं सर्वे भाग्यनगर समित्याः सभायाः कृते एकत्रीभूताः सत्यस्य उद्घाटनार्थं प्रचार प्रसारार्थं शान्त्यर्थं तुष्ट्यर्थं च अनुसन्धानपरायणाः तदा संघटनकुशलाः इतिहासविदो अद्य सर्वे इति महान् संकल्पम् अवधार्य नमस्तु. ఇప్పుడు మన సమితి ప్రధాన కార్యదర్శి శ్రీ ముదుగొండ ఇందిశేఖర్ గారిని ఇతిహాస సంకలన సమితి గురించి సంక్షిప్తంగా పరిచయించమని కోరుతున్నాను.
అందరికీ నమస్కారం. ఇవాళ ఈ కార్యక్రమాన్ని మనం నిర్వహించుకుంటున్నాం. భాగ్యనగర్ ఇతిహాస సంకలన సమితి, భాగ్యనగర్ యూనిట్ వారు. ఇవాళ కార్యక్రమం గురించి నేను కొద్దిగా పరిచయం చేస్తాను. ఇవాళ మన మధ్యన ఉన్నటువంటి వారు శ్రీ వై రామస్వామి శాస్త్రి గారు. వారు అమెరికాలో ఉంటారు, మేరీలాండ్లో. అక్కడ ఒక కంపెనీకి డైరెక్టర్గా పనిచేశారు, విశ్రాంత, రిటైర్డ్. తర్వాత చరిత్ర పరిశోధనల పట్ల అవగాహన, తర్వాత ఉత్సుకత, హిస్టారియన్, ఆ విధంగా వారికి ఉన్న మరొక ఇదేమంటే పండిత కోట వెంకటాచలం గారి పేరు మన అందరం వినే ఉంటాం. పండిత కోట వెంకటాచలం గారి మనవడు అది కూడా వారిది ఒక. మరి పండిత కోట వెంకటాచలం గారు ఎవరు? వారి పరిచయాన్ని నేను కొద్దిగా చేస్తాను, ఇంగ్లీష్లో చేస్తాను. ఇండియన్ chronology has serious distortions introduced by European entomologists along with willful tampering of evidence to fit within a biblical time frame. By establishing Chandragupta Maurya as the contemporary of Alexander, they introduced a 1207-year error in the Indian chronology between 3138 BC and 1193 AD. So today's talk will provide an overview of the works of Bharatacharita Bhaskara. కోట వెంకటాచలం గారి ఉన్న బిరుదు భారత చరిత భాస్కర్. పండిత Kota Venkatachalam garu, 1885 to 1959, a Vedic scholar who became a Shankaracharya of Sringeri Parampara, using a multidisciplinary approach combining knowledge of mathematics, geography, history, astronomy and Jyotisha Shastra. He spent 51 years researching and authoring over 24 books, reconstructing Indian chronology from primary sources, Shruti and Smriti. While considering literary evidence to be the authoritative source, he meticulously and painstakingly corroborated and validated his research with archaeological evidence, numismatic evidence, inscriptions and reviews by peer scholars. The innumerable sources of his research include the Rik and Atharva Veda, Surya Siddhanta, Garga Samhita, Brihad Samhita, Puranas, Itihasas, Kalhanas Rajatarangini, Nepala Rajavamshavali and Kaliyuga Rajavruttanta. The key to understanding the dates in the Puranas and Itihasas is an understanding of the three Indian eras in prevalence. The Yudhishthira era, 3138 BC, the Kali era, 3102 BC, and Yudhishthira Kala era, Saptarshi Shaka, Laukikabda or Kashmirabda, 3076 BC. Knowledge of the era used in various texts is key to normalize and reconcile dates. The reconstructed chronology is presented in 4 parts: very ancient, ancient, medieval and modern. Beginning with the creation of the universe, ancient migrations from India to all parts of the globe, establishing the date of the Mahabharata war, to re-establishing the correct chronology from 3138 BC until 1193 AD. This has helped correctly date Buddha 1887 to 1807 BC, Chandragupta Maurya 1534 BC, Adi Shankaracharya 509 BC, and established the historicity of Vikramaditya and Shalivahana. We are very happy to have a scholarly person like Shri Y. Ramaswamy Sastry garu amongst us to explain and further on this topic. Itihasa Sankalana Samiti సంస్థ 1960లలో శ్రీ బాబాసాహెబ్ ఆప్టే గారు ప్రారంభించారంటే అప్పుడు పని ప్రారంభించారు. దాని తర్వాత 1980లలో మన దగ్గర ఉన్న శ్రీరామ్ సాఠే అనేటువంటి ఒక ఆర్ఎస్ఎస్ ప్రచారక్ వారిని నేను చూశాను. వారు ఇక్కడ ఇతిహాస పని, తర్వాత ముఖ్యంగా సరస్వతి నది యొక్క ఆధారాలు, పూర్వ విశేషాలు ఎక్కడ తర్వాత ఆ విషయం మీద వీళ్ళు చేశారు, కొంత రీసెర్చ్ చేశారు ఇతిహాస సంకల్ప సమితి వాళ్ళు. దాని తర్వాత మహాభారత వారు భండార్కర్ ఓరియంటల్ రీసెర్చ్ ఇన్స్టిట్యూట్ అని ఉన్నది పూనాలో, వాళ్ళతో కలిసి కూడా ఈ భండార్కర్ వాళ్ళతో కలిసి మహాభారత వార్ డేట్ అది కూడా వాళ్ళు ఫిక్స్ చేశారు. ఇంకా అనేకమైన హిస్టారికల్ ఎవిడెన్సెస్తో మన చరిత్ర వక్రీకరింపబడ్డ చరిత్ర, అంటే డిస్టార్టెడ్. మనమందరం కూడా, మనమంటే మనమే కాదు, మొత్తం భారతదేశంలో ఉన్న 140 కోట్ల మంది ఇట్లాగా గత 150-200 సంవత్సరాలుగా మనం తప్పుడు చరిత్రనే చదువుకుంటున్నాం. ఇవాళ శాస్త్రి గారు ఆ విషయాన్ని కూడా మన ముందు కొంత ప్రస్తావిస్తారు. ఈ తప్పుడు చరిత్రలో భాగమే మనమంతా. అసలు మనకి కరెక్ట్ మన చరిత్ర ఏమిటో తెలియదు, మన పూర్వీకులు ఎవరో తెలియదు, మన రాణా ప్రతాప్ ఎవడో తెలియదు, రాణా సంఘ ఎవడో, ఎవరికి అంత ఫుల్ వైట్ ఒక తెల్ల గోడ, తెల్ల కాగితం లాగా ఉంది. వాడు స్కూల్లోకి పోతాడు, ఏదో ఔరంగజేబ్ గురించి చదువుకుంటాడు. మొన్న ఛావా సినిమా వచ్చేటప్పటికి ఛావా సినిమాలో అయ్యో ఇంత ఉందా అని ప్రజలకి భావోద్వేగాలు మనం వాట్సాప్లో, మనం సోషల్ మీడియాలో చూస్తున్నాం. అంటే నిజమైన చరిత్ర తెలిస్తే ఆ వ్యక్తి భారతదేశంతో చక్కగా అనుసంధానింపబడతాడు. అతనికి తన పూర్వుల పట్ల, తన సంస్కృతి పట్ల, తన ధర్మం పట్ల మంచి గౌరవము, అభిమానము, ప్రేమ ఇవన్నీ కలుగుతాయి. ఎవరికైతే తెలియో వాడికి ఏముందండి, ఇది కూడా ఒక భూమి, ఇది కూడా ఒక ఎర్నింగ్ ల్యాండే, ఇక్కడ కాకపోతే అమెరికా, అమెరికా కాకపోతే ఆస్ట్రేలియా, అలా వెళ్ళిపోవడానికి సుముఖంగా ఉంటారు. ఇవాళ ఇతిహాస సంకలన సమితి చరిత్ర ద్వారా భారతదేశ సమాజంలో భారతీయులకి చరిత్రని పునరావృతం చేస్తూ సత్యమైన చరిత్రని చెప్పటము, ఆ చరిత్ర ద్వారా మళ్ళీ జాతిని వైభవాన్వితమైనటువంటి దిశకి తీసుకువెళ్ళడానికి ప్రయత్నం చేసేటువంటి సంస్థ. ఆ సంస్థలో భాగంగా మనము ఇక్కడ భాగ్యనగర్లో యూనిట్లో మనం పనులు చేస్తున్నాం. మనం చేసే అనేక రకాల పనులు చేస్తున్నాం. మనమేమో సెమినార్లు నిర్వహించాము, ఉపన్యాసాలు పెట్టుకుంటాము, తర్వాత కల్చరల్ యాక్టివిటీస్ పెడతాము, నాటకాలు వేస్తాము, తర్వాత మహిళా సంచలనమని ఈ ర్యాంప్ వాక్ అంటారు. కానీ ర్యాంప్ వాక్ అంటే బయట ర్యాంప్ వాక్లా కాదు. మన మహిళా సంచలనం ఏంటి, మన భారతీయ స్త్రీలు, భారతీయ మహిళలు, రాణి గైడింగ్లు, లేకపోతే సోదరి నివేదిత, ఝాన్సీ లక్ష్మీబాయి, రుద్రమదేవి, అహల్యాబాయి హోల్కర్, జిజియామాత, సీత, సావిత్రి, సీత సావిత్రి, తర్వాత ఇట్లా పౌరాణికమైన గాంధారి, మండోదరి, ఇట్లాంటి వాళ్ళందరినీ వీళ్ళ ర్యాంప్ వాక్, ఇట్స్ ర్యాంప్ వాక్ విత్ ఎ డిఫరెన్స్ అని అంటారు. అట్లాగా ఆ కార్యక్రమం నిర్వహించాం. అది కూడా కొన్ని చోట్ల నిర్వహించాం. అది కూడా కొంచెం బాగా ప్రసిద్ధి చెందినది. దాంతో ఇలాంటి కార్యక్రమాలు, తర్వాత ఇతిహాస యాత్రలని, స్థలాల సందర్శన, చారిత్రక స్థలాల సందర్శన, ఊర్లకి వెళ్ళటము, ఈ కార్యక్రమాలన్నీ మనం చేస్తున్నాము. భాగ్యనగర్ యూనిట్లో సెమినార్లు నిర్వహించాము, ఉపన్యాసాలు పెట్టుకుంటాము, తర్వాత కల్చరల్ యాక్టివిటీస్ పెడతాము, నాటకాలు వేస్తాము, తర్వాత మహిళా సంచలనమని ఈ ర్యాంప్ వాక్ అంటారు. కానీ ర్యాంప్ వాక్ అంటే బయట ర్యాంప్ వాక్లా కాదు. మన మహిళా సంచలనం ఏంటి, మన భారతీయ స్త్రీలు, భారతీయ మహిళలు, రాణి గైడింగ్లు, లేకపోతే సోదరి నివేదిత, ఝాన్సీ లక్ష్మీబాయి, రుద్రమదేవి, అహల్యాబాయి హోల్కర్, జిజియామాత, సీత, సావిత్రి, సీత సావిత్రి, తర్వాత ఇట్లా పౌరాణికమైన గాంధారి, మండోదరి, ఇట్లాంటి వాళ్ళందరినీ వీళ్ళ ర్యాంప్ వాక్, ఇట్స్ ర్యాంప్ వాక్ విత్ ఎ డిఫరెన్స్ అని అంటారు. అట్లాగా ఆ కార్యక్రమం నిర్వహించాం. అది కూడా కొన్ని చోట్ల నిర్వహించాం. అది కూడా కొంచెం బాగా ప్రసిద్ధి చెందినది. దాంతో ఇలాంటి కార్యక్రమాలు, తర్వాత ఇతిహాస యాత్రలని, స్థలాల సందర్శన, చారిత్రక స్థలాల సందర్శన, ఊర్లకి వెళ్ళటము, ఈ కార్యక్రమాలన్నీ మనం చేస్తున్నాము. భాగ్యనగర్ యూనిట్లో దానిలో భాగంగా మనము సంవత్సరానికి ఒక 3-4 సార్లు కలుస్తుంటాం కూడా ఫిజికల్గా. కలిసినప్పుడు ఒక పెద్ద మనిషితో మనము ఒక మంచి ఉపన్యాసం ఒకటి ఏర్పాటు చేసుకుంటాము. ఎందుకంటే సబ్జెక్ట్ నాలెడ్జ్ ఉండాలి మన కార్యకర్తలకి, నెంబర్ 1. నెంబర్ 2, కార్యక్రమాలని కూడా వచ్చే ఏం కార్యక్రమాలు ఉన్నాయి, ఈ ప్లానింగ్ ఇవన్నీ కూడా చేస్తూ ఉంటాము. ఇవాళ ఆ సందర్భంగా రామశాస్త్రి గారి ఉపన్యాసాన్ని మనము ఏర్పరచుకున్నాము. నేను ఇంకా ఎక్కువసేపు మీ మధ్యన ఉండదలుచుకోలేదు. భాగ్యనగర్ యూనిట్ యొక్క కార్యకలాపాలని మీకు దాదాపుగా క్లుప్తంగా పరిచయం చేశాను. తర్వాత అంశాన్ని సాయి ప్రసాద్ గారు చెప్తారు.
ఇప్పుడు మనందరం ఎంతో ఆసక్తిగా ఎదురు చూస్తున్నటువంటి కార్యక్రమం వస్తుంది. శ్రీ రామస్వామి శాస్త్రి గారు తమ యొక్క కార్యక్రమాన్ని ఇప్పుడు తీసుకుంటారు.
నమస్కారం అండి. చాలా జనరస్ ఇంట్రొడక్షన్ ఇచ్చారు. మీకు పరిచయం చేయవలసిన పేరు నాది కాదు, పండిత కోట వెంకటాచలం. నేను హిస్టోరియన్ కాదు, ఈ రీసెర్చ్ నాది కాదు. ఇది పండిత కోట వెంకటాచలం గారి రీసెర్చ్. నేను కేవలం మెసెంజర్ని. సో ఆయన చేసిన రీసెర్చ్తో మీకు పరిచయం చేద్దామని నా ప్రయత్నం. అండ్ ప్రజెంటేషన్ అంతా ఇంగ్లీష్లో ఉంది. సో మీకు అభ్యంతరం లేకపోతే నా ప్రజెంటేషన్ కూడా నేను ఇంగ్లీష్లోనే ఇస్తాను. థ్యాంక్స్ అండి. సో ఇందులో టైటిల్ చూడండి, ఇట్స్ రీకన్స్ట్రక్షన్ ఆఫ్ ఇండిక్ క్రోనాలజీ ఫ్రమ్ శృతి అండ్ స్మృతి బై పండిత్ కోట వెంకటాచలం. నా అదేమిటంటే ఆయన శృంగేరి ఉపపీఠం ఒకటి ఉండేది, అభినవ వీరపాక్ష పీఠం అని ఉండేది, దానికి అధిపతిగా చేశారు. ఆయన సన్యాసం పుచ్చుకుని ఆ పీఠాధిపతిగా మారినప్పుడు ఆయన పేరు కూడా మారింది. జగద్గురు శంకరాచార్య అద్వయానంద శంకర భారతీ స్వామి ఆయన పేరు. కాకపోతే ఆయన రాసిన పుస్తకాలన్నీ తూరియాశ్రమంలో రాశారు కాబట్టి కోట వెంకటాచలం అనే పేరుతోనే పబ్లిష్ అవ్వబడ్డాయి. సో చేత ఆ పేరు ఎక్కువగా వాడుతూ ఉంటాను నేను. ఆయన శంకరాచార్యులు గారు నేను ఆయన గురించి మాట్లాడినప్పుడు నేను స్వామి గారు అంటాను నేను, లేకపోతే పండిత్జీ అంటాను నేను. సో ఆ పండిత్జీ స్వామి దాన్ని బట్టి ఆయన ఏజ్లో ఎప్పటి సంగతి మాట్లాడుతున్నాం అనేది మీకు కొంచెం అర్థం అవుతుంది. సో దాట్స్ ఇట్. నేను ఇంగ్లీష్లో ఇందులో ఆయనకి చాలా బిరుదులు వచ్చాయి ఓవర్ హిజ్ లైఫ్ టైం. అందులో మోస్ట్ పాపులర్ బిరుదు భారత చరిత్ర భాస్కర్. సో మీరు ఆ బొమ్మ చూస్తే అది దట్ ఈస్ వాట్ వీ హ్యావ్ ట్రై టు రీక్రియేట్ సింబాలిక్లీ. వెనకాల చూస్తే మీకు ఇండియా మ్యాప్ కనిపిస్తుంది, అంటే భారత అండ్ దెన్ ఆ రేస్లో ఒక్కొక్క రే మీద ఒక డేట్ ఉంటుంది. ఆయన వ్యాలిడేట్ చేసి రీఎస్టాబ్లిష్ చేసిన డేట్స్, కరెక్ట్ చేసిన డేట్స్. సో అది రైజింగ్ సన్ లాంటి బొమ్మ. సో అది అండ్ మధ్యలో ఆయన ఫోటో. సో భారత చరిత్ర భాస్కర పండిత కోట వెంకటాచలం, అది సింబాలిక్ మీనింగ్ ఆ పిక్చర్కి. కింద డాక్టర్ వేపా కోస్లా ఈజ్ ఇండాలజిస్ట్ దట్ ఐ రెస్పెక్ట్ వెరీ మచ్. ఆయన ఇప్పుడు లేరు, కానీ ఉన్నప్పుడు ఐ ట్రై టు ఇంటరాక్ట్ విత్ హిమ్. ఆయన కోట వెంకటాచలం గారి రీసెర్చ్కి చాలా పెద్ద ఫ్యాన్. ఆయన కూడా చాలా వర్క్ చేశారు. బట్ ఆయన కోట వెంకటాచలం గారికి ఇచ్చిన ట్రిబ్యూట్ ఆయన పుస్తకం నుంచి ఇక్కడ రీప్రొడ్యూస్ చేశాను. ఆయన ఏం రాశారంటే, నో హిస్టరీ ఆఫ్ ఇండియా వుడ్ బి కంప్లీట్ if it does not include the work of Kota Venkatachalam. The great historian of the modern era remains largely unknown in his own native land, despite a record of research and publications that would place him in the category of Will Durant or Arnold Toynbee. So, ఇది ఆయన పుస్తకం నుంచి ఆయన ట్రిబ్యూట్ ఇచ్చారు ఫుట్ నోట్లో. ఆయన రెఫరెన్స్ తీసుకున్నప్పుడు అక్కడి నుంచి నేను తీసి ఇక్కడ రీప్రొడ్యూస్ చేశాను. డాక్టర్ వేపా కోస్లా, ఆయన పుస్తకం పేరు ఆరిజిన్స్ ఆఫ్ ఆస్ట్రానమీ క్యాలెండర్ అండ్ టైమ్, 2011లో పబ్లిష్ అయిన పుస్తకం అది. ఆయన ఆర్గనైజేషన్ పేరు ఇండిక్ స్టడీస్ ఫౌండేషన్. ఇంటర్నెట్ మీద ఉంది, మీరు గూగుల్ చేస్తే మీకు ఆ సైట్ కనిపిస్తుంది. అందులో ఆయన రీసెర్చ్ కూడా చాలా ఉంది. అది కూడా మీకు ఇంట్రెస్ట్ వీలుని బట్టి చెక్ చేయండి. ఏమండి, అంటే మీరు గూగుల్లో ఇండిక్ స్టడీస్ ఫౌండేషన్ టైప్ చేస్తే మీకు వెబ్సైట్ దొరుకుతుంది మీకు. నెక్స్ట్ స్లైడ్ ప్లీజ్. సో ఇది ఐ ఆర్గనైజ్ దిస్ ప్రెజెంటేషన్ ఇంటూ 3 parts. Part 1 is a biography of the author, and there we talk about his methodology, how did he approach the reconstruction, and what was the approach. So that's the first section. Second section, Purva Paksha. Problem ఏమిటి, what is the problem we are trying to solve? అది is defined in the second section. Third section is the Uttara Paksha. అంటే రీకన్స్ట్రక్టెడ్ క్రానాలజీ ఏమిటి ఫ్రమ్ శృతి అండ్ స్మృతి. అది 4 భాగాలుగా రాశారు. ఇవాళ టైము కారణంగా నేను ఒక లాస్ట్ సెక్షన్ మాత్రమే డీల్ చేస్తాను. చాలా ఇంపార్టెంట్ సెక్షన్ అది. దట్ ఈస్ ఫ్రమ్ ది మహాభారత వార్ టు 1193, 3138 BC to 1193. అది నేను ఇవాళ కవర్ చేస్తాను. నెక్స్ట్ స్లైడ్ ప్లీజ్. సో ఆయన బయోగ్రఫీ, he was born in 1885, attained Siddhi in 1959. He was a traditional scholar, well grounded in Shruti and Smriti. He began research at the age of 23. In 1908, he started his research. He continued his research for 40 years till 1948. And in 1948, because the reason he kept them in manuscript form is as he was discovering new information, he had to go back and make corrections to his research. And that's why he kept it in manuscript form rather than publish them. And in 1948, he thought he had done enough research because there were no more data sources available to research. And so he started publishing his books. 1949 was the first book, and 1957 was the last book. So now I do want to point out 1908 to 1948, this was before we had telephone lines, before we had internet, before we had Google, before we had PDF files and copy-paste functions. So this was a time where he had to go to state libraries or matas because they had extensive libraries of this kind of reference material. He would often travel to Chennai. He was an Orthodox Brahmin who lived a very Orthodox lifestyle. And when I think about what he must have gone through traveling to Jaipur, traveling to Chennai, traveling and then living there. It must have been a very, very tough life. So it was not easy. These books are not usually lent out from libraries. They're reference material. So you have to sit there and take notes. And so that's how he had to compile his research work. So I just wanted to point that out. So, and the picture on the right is the Mahaswami of Sringeri sitting on the left and Panditji on the right. And he's being initiated as the Peethadipati of the Abhinava Veerapaksha Peetham in Hampi. Next slide, please. Now his methodology. His methodology is that he believed texts are the primary source and the most important source of evidence. Text first. Everything else can be used for corroboration, like astrology, astronomy, archaeology, inscriptions, prashastis. All these can be used to corroborate, but text is the primary source. And now there, I think he had a tremendous amount of rigor in his research. So it's not like he just copied and pasted from a source. He would actually try to confirm that date from an independent source. And that's called triangulation. So the amount of triangulation in his research work was unparalleled. So it was amazing. And we'll see some examples. He was an active participant in conferences. I listed 3 papers he has presented at different times. The first one is Santrami, Santracotus, and Santrasiptus in Jaipur in 1951. The predetermined plot in Indian chronology in 1953 in Ahmedabad. And that's where he was exposing the distortions made by the British and said that what was available in textbooks was wrong. It was full of distortions. And he calls it the predetermined plot in Indian chronology. And then, of course, he was an active contributor. I do want to point out the Andhra Historical Society at Rajahmundry. It is a clearinghouse for research scholars to present their research for peer review. And if in peer reviews people have questions, then the author is expected to respond and defend his assertions and conclusions. Now, 1952, the president of the society was Rao Bahadur P.V. Kane. Anybody heard that name? Rao Bahadur P.V. Kane is a Bharat Ratna for history. And he was the president. So I'm trying to describe the peer group that Panditji had. The president of the society was Rao Bahadur P.V. Kane. Bal Gangadhar Tilak had written a book to which Panditji wrote a rebuttal, criticizing it. We also had R.C. Majumdar. K.D. Setna was his successor to carry on the research. So these are the peer group that Panditji used to interact with. And I'll show you some examples as we come across. So the point really here is that this is the insider's view. He was a true insider to the tradition. You cannot get a better insider than the Shankaracharya from Sringeri to give you an inside opinion of the tradition. So this is not sitting on the outside looking in. This is from the inside looking out and trying to refute distortions. Next slide, please. His approach is, so given the methodology, text is the most important evidence, yes? So based on that methodology, the approach was, step 1, establish the sheet anchor. What is the sheet anchor? A sheet anchor is a date on which other dates depend. So if the sheet anchor is wrong, the other dates become wrong. So we have to establish the correct sheet anchor first, and then all the dates will be correct. So he decided the correct sheet anchor is the date of the Mahabharata war. So that is the first date to be established. So once you establish the date of the Mahabharata war, you can then fit all the other dates and they will be correct. So that then, number 2, once you have established the sheet anchor, then what you have to do is follow the genealogies from the Mahabharata war of all the important kingdoms. And you will get all the royal dynasties. And in each royal dynasty, you can see the succession of kings and how long they ruled. And you can see who the contemporaries are to the others. So let's say when Yudhishthira was ruling Hastinapur, who was the king at Ayodhya? Who was the king in Magadha? So by doing this, you can see who were contemporaries to whom. And then, of course, correlate this across multiple sources because we have other texts. You have Puranas, you have Itihasas, you have other texts also. and Surya Siddhanta, for example, Brihat Samhita, Garga Samhita. You have all these texts, and the question is, you want to triangulate the data that you have got from all these texts, all these sources, so that you have a good amount of triangulation and are satisfied that your dates are actually correct and cannot be challenged. So you have multiple evidences. There's a tremendous amount of evidence. Sometimes you come across evidence that seems to be contradictory. So as a historian, you have to create a harmony when you're trying to build a chronology. So there are some things that you may at times have to ignore, but then at other times the triangulation is important to make sure that your dates are actually validated and verified. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, if you could go back for a second. The last source is foreign sources. So foreign sources are also a source of data and information. And there I mentioned Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni visited India in the 11th century, and he documented some of his findings, and they corroborate some of the data that we find in other sources. And so we'll point that out as we come across it. And so what Panditji's contribution is, number one, he uses what is called Persian synchronism. So he uses a date from Persian history to establish a date in Indian history. So that is Persian synchronism, because their calendar is very different from the Hindu calendar. The AD-BC calendar is very different from the Hindu calendar. There is no way to translate a date from one calendar to the other. It's not possible. So what you need is synchronism. What is synchronism? You need a global event that connects the two calendars. And that is, once you make that connection, then it's easy to traverse the two calendars up and down. And then you can make a correlation. So that is synchronism. What the East India Company did is they used Greek synchronism to introduce distortions. And Panditji said that's wrong, and he uses Persian synchronism to establish the correct chronology of India. Next slide, please. So his works provide a complete framework. So what do I mean by that? Number one, he identifies most distortions in one place in his books. You have all the distortions identified. Number two, he has constructed a complete chronology from primary sources, from 3138 BC to 1193. So why 3138? Because he establishes that as the date of the Mahabharata war. So the date of the Mahabharata war is 3138. And then he stops at 1193 because that's when the Muslim invasions began. And our history from that time is well documented. So this is the date range that he spent 51 years reconstructing from primary sources. Number three, he completely reconciles provincial sources of history, which is Nepal's history, which is documented in the Nepal Rajavamsavali. Then you have the history of Kashmir, which is documented in Kalhana's Rajadarangini. So these are provincial sources of history, and he reconciles all his findings against these. So I give some examples here. The history of Magadha from the Puranas, history of Nepal, Kashmir, Buddhist and Jain texts. Why are these important? If you have to find the date of Buddha, you would expect to find them in Buddhist texts. So looking at Buddhist texts is also important. And Mahavir Jain is also important. And we'll see why he's important, because Mahavir Jain was the contemporary of that is what we have been taught. Mahavir Jain was the contemporary of Adi Shankara. So Adi Shankara was fighting Jainism at the time, not Buddhism. So we'll see evidence of that. So anyway, the point is that yes, he reconciles his findings from multiple sources of information. And number four, he identifies all his references, text, chapter, sloka. So if you don't agree with his interpretation, he's told you what reference he used. You can check the reference for yourself, draw your own conclusions, write your own chronology. But this is the level of transparency. He's not hiding the sources. He's identifying, giving credit to the sources and saying, this is where I drew my information from. So this way, he provides a complete framework for anyone that wants to reconstruct Indian chronology. Oh, and his original finding, he was the first person in 1949 to refute the Aryan invasion theory. And he was actually promoting an out of India theory. And if time permits, I will cover that, or that was a section I was going to skip because we didn't have enough time. But, and then of course he challenges the AD-BC calendar, which is very arbitrary because the calendar was started in the 6th century AD, 600 years after Christ was crucified. Yeah, anyhow, next slide, please. So, data sources. The common misconception is that Puranas contain no historical information. You've all heard that? Have you all heard that? Yes, it's wrong. It is totally wrong. The reason is, what are Puranas? For a text to be called a Mahapurana, it has to meet 10 characteristics. We call the Dasalakshana. For a text to be called an Upapurana, it must meet 5 characteristics called the Panchalakshana. So the Panchalakshana are common to both, and what are they? I've listed them here. Sarga, Pratisarga, Manvantara, Vamsa, Vamsavicharita. These are the 5 sections that any Purana must contain. What do they have? The Sarga describes the process of Srishti. The Pratisarga describes the destruction at the end of Srishti. Manvantara describes the cosmic units of time, and time permitting, I do have a slide on that. The Vamsa identifies genealogies of kings, Gotras from the founding rishis. And the Vamsanacharita identifies historical personalities that were important, identifies their achievements and events. So chronologies can be reconstructed from Vamsa and Vamsanacharita. Therefore, Puranas do have historical information, and they are a major source, major input to the reconstruction of any chronology. Next slide, please. Okay, that was the biography of the author and the methodology. Now, what is the problem we're trying to solve? That's section 2, which is the Purvabhaksha. So, next slide. Okay, distortions in Indian history. Who were the people that introduced the distortions? I have a sampling of names. The list is actually very long. I've tried to identify the most important ones, the people who did the most damage. That's William Jones, Max Miller, George Mueller, Fleet, Purgator, and so on and so forth. These are the people. Now, William Jones lived in the 18th century, around 1750. Max Miller lived 80 years later, 1830 to 1900, Max Miller. And all the others were contemporaries of Max Miller. So they all lived after William Jones. So William Jones did the damage first, and 80 years later, these people as a team, they strengthened the distortions further. And we'll see examples of that. So why? Why did they do that? Because William Jones was a staunch Christian. So when he was appointed a Supreme Court judge of Calcutta, Bengal, he had a lot of free time. And he used his free time studying Sanskrit. He was a linguist. He knew a lot of languages. But when he was reading Sanskrit texts, he was reading them with a Christian lens. So when you talk about, Dvitiya Pararthe, Sveta Varaha Kalpe, Vaivasata Manvantare, you translate all of that, it tells you the earth is 2 billion years old. And that boggled his mind because according to the Old Testament, God created the earth in 6 days, right? And took rest on the 7th. And that happened in 4004 BC. So when he saw 2 billion years, it blew his mind because he said, he was a Christian. He could not accept that date. So he decided Indian history had to be distorted and shrunk. And he decided Indian history had to start in 2029 BC. So he set the target and said, you cannot be older than this date because the Bible says so. Okay. Then what did he do? He removed 1,000 years before the Mahabharata war. Well, before that, what he did was, he said everything before the Kali Yuga is fiction, written by poets. So he threw all that out and said, let's start from the Kali Yuga. And he says, in the Kali Yuga, they didn't understand our dates. So they threw them out also and said, we'll use the AD-BC calendar. Then he took a lot of source material and discarded that. And then he took out 1,000 years before the Mahabharata war because he had to push that to 2029 BC. And then because history slides and the slides further, right? Yeah, he removed 1,300 years after the war to shrink the timeline. So that's the amount of damage he did. 1,000 years before and about 1,200 years after. they dated events incorrectly. They shrunk the Nepal Rajavamsavali actually existed 1,000 years before the Mahabharata war. That's how old the Nepal Rajavamsavali is. And with some distortions, they were able to shrink that by 3,400 years. The Nepal Rajavamsavali, Kalhana's Rajtarangini, they made interpolations into the Puranas. They introduced distortions into Puranas, and by doing so, they said, these documents are not reliable. So they're not qualified to be input sources, and they discarded them. What did they use? They used very skimpy evidence from foreign travelers, like Megasthenes. Everybody heard Megasthenes? Megasthenes, Fahian, Hyunsang, you heard of all these. That was given a lot of importance. So think about it. Hyunsang is in India in the 7th century AD. And when he makes a comment about Chandragupta Maurya, who lived in 1534 BC, they are separated by 2,200 years. How accurate can that opinion be? Yet the Brits thought this is gospel. And so their history was based on the accounts of foreign travelers. And they discarded what we had to offer to them. And this is how they wrote our history. And that's what we are learning today. And of course, needless to say that it's wrong. Okay, and the last thing is that they actually forged coins. They even forged inscriptions. They even forged a text to prove their dates. And so Panditji exposes all of them in his books. Now, the last one. So the point I want to leave you with is that our history was written by philologists. Everybody familiar with the term philologist? Philologists wrote our history based on skimpy evidence of foreign travelers. And that's the tragedy of the whole situation. Now, let me show you. I talked about Greek synchronism. And here is Greek synchronism. This is what William Jones saw. The source is a book by Megasthenes. Okay, let me explain. Megasthenes was sent to India as an ambassador. Alexander came to India. He was defeated. He went back, died on the way. His general was Seleucus. Seleucus sent Megasthenes to India, and Megasthenes lived in India for a few years. And then he wrote a book on his stay in India. The book was called Indica. This book was never found. And there were two historians called Arrian and Strabo. Arrian in the 1st century BC and Strabo in 200 AD. And Megasthenes existed in 327 BC. So Megasthenes existed in 327 BC. Arrian is 1st century BC. Strabo is 200 AD. None of these books were found. None of these books were ever found. Nobody has seen them. But in the 19th century, there's a guy called J.W. McCrindle who wrote an English book and said this is based on Arrian's description of what Megasthenes saw. So just think about how ridiculous this is. The book is written in the 19th century. It is written based on what Arrian and Strabo wrote about what Megasthenes saw. Now, 19th century, Strabo was 2nd century AD. Arrian was 1st century BC. And all these three people are writing about what Alexander saw in 327 BC. How accurate can that be? How accurate can that be? Anyhow, so what did William Jones find in Indica? He found 3 names. And those 3 names are Sandrames, Sandracotus, Sandrasiptus. Everybody heard these names? Sandrames, Sandracotus, Sandrasiptus. So he started looking at Indian texts to see the names of kings and who might have existed then, because these are anglicized names or Greek names for Indian names. And so he found Chandragupta seemed to match Sandracotus. But then there were 2 Chandraguptas. There was a Chandragupta of the Mauryan Empire and there was a Chandragupta of the Gupta Empire. So which one is the correct one. Now, if you look at the next name, Sandramis resembles Chandramas more than it resembles Mahapadmananda. Yes? Anybody think Sandramis resembles Mahapadmananda? I mean, does it take a philologist to discover which one it matches more? When you look at the third one, Sandrasiptus resembles Samudragupta more than Bindusara. It was clear, all the evidence was pointing to the Gupta dynasty. Yet William Jones mapped it to the Maurya dynasty. And by doing so, he pulled Chandragupta Maurya from 1534 to 327. And that is an error of 1207 years. And with that, the entire dynasty moves, their successors move, all the Indian history gets distorted. So that's the example I wanted to show you. This is Greek synchronism, and Panditji uses Persian synchronism to make corrections. Next slide, please. So, results of these distortions, I won't read the whole thing. Buddha, Chandragupta Maurya, Patanjali, Adi Shankara, everybody moved forward by 1200 years, we saw that. And then, of course, you can see some more. The Andhra Satavahanas moved some 600 years. The Sungas, Kanvas, Andhras were made contemporaries, even though they ruled one after the other. They made contemporaries because he had to shrink the timeline. He removed Vikramaditya and Salivahana entirely from history and said these two are fictional characters. So he removed Vikramaditya, Salivahana, and the four Agnivamsa dynasties. 4 dynasties, 1300 years were removed from history, and they said this is fiction. Think about it. Both of them are Chakravartis. There's a difference between a king and a Chakravarti. A king rules a kingdom. A Chakravarti rules an empire. So these two actually established empires. They had, the Vikram Samvat is named after Vikramaditya. Salivahana Saka is a calendar named after Salivahana after they become Chakravarti. Yet William Jones says these two people are fictitious. And he removes them from history. So these are the results of the distortions. And just a sampling. I didn't have place to make a longer list, but this gives you an idea of the kind of distortions introduced. Next slide. Oh, one second. The box on the right are 8 types of criticism Panditji levels against the English people. And so I'll just read them. They misread evidence, they forged evidence, they misinterpreted evidence, they destroyed evidence, they rejected genuine evidence, and so on and so forth. So these are the 8 criticisms, and he gives examples of each in his books. Next slide, please. So that is the problem to be solved. You have completely distorted history. You have some examples of the kind of distortions made. So now the Pura Uttar Paksha has to be a reconstructed chronology. So we'll go to the last section now. Next slide, please. Oh, times, yes. So to reconstruct the modern history of Bharat, Panditji says you need only 3 sources. 3 sources are, you need the history of Magadha, you need the history of Nepal, and you need the history of Kashmir. With these 3 sources, you can reconstruct Indian history. Now, along with that, you need to have knowledge of 3 important eras. So before we go there, we did not have the ADBC calendar, right? Then the question is, how were dates represented? How were dates represented? Anybody? How were dates represented? We didn't say 2000 BC. Alexander, no, well, Chandragupta of the Gupta dynasty didn't write 327 BC. Right? How did he represent his own date? Excuse me? Exactly, but which Seka? So there are many Sekas. So the point is, yes, we use Sekas as our calendars, but we had so many of them, you have to be aware of which Seka is being used. Otherwise, there are several. Depending on the event, we have to pick the correct one. Depending on the text, we have to pick the correct one. So I just wanted to introduce them. So of those, we have a large number, but of that large number, 3 are key, is what Panditji is saying. You need 3 sources of information, which is Magadha, Kashmir, and Nepal, and you need to know these 3 eras in particular, which is the Yudhishthira Seka, Saptarishi Seka, and the Kali Seka. Why? because the Puranas, the Magadha history is in the Puranas. That is where you get the Magadha history from. All the dates in the Puranas are in Yudhishthira Saka. They're all in Yudhishthira Saka. Saptarishi Saka is what Kalhana used in Rajatarangadi. So if you look at the history of Kashmir, all the dates are in Saptarishi Saka. And you look at the Nepal Rajavamsavali, all the dates are in Kalisaka. If you're not aware of this, you will make mistakes in trying to translate dates. So you have to know the source, you have to know what Saka was used, so you can normalize and reconcile dates. Right? So this is all that you need to reconstruct chronology. So given this background, let's see how he did it. What did we say step one was in the approach? Step one was establish the correct sheet anchor, which is the Mahabharata war. So that's the first thing you have to do, establish the sheet anchor first. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the shakas? Yes, we have a lot of shakas, but here they are. These are the most important ones. We'll start from the, now this table starts with the Mahabharata war. There were shakas before, but they are not included here. And then there are some that are very, very large time scales that are beyond human comprehension. Brahmamana, Vaivasvatamana, these are huge timelines which are beyond our comprehension, so those are not included here. We include only from the Mahabharata war till modern times. So the first one is Yudhishthira Saka. So Yudhishthira Saka was established when Yudhishthira became Chakravarti, and that is after the Mahabharata war. A Saka is normally started when there is a Chakravarti and a dynasty is replacing an old dynasty. So you create a calendar in honor of that Chakravarti. And Yudhishthira was a Chakravarti. And so when he won the Mahabharata war and became a Chakravarti, they started a new calendar and they called it Yudhishthira Saka. Right? Number two, Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga, Dwapara Yuga ended with Sri Krishna's Narayana. Dwapara Yuga ended, Kali Yuga started. And so when that happened, well, Panditji gives the date and time. He said this happened precisely at 2:27 a.m. on February 20th, 3102. That is the precise timing of the beginning of Kali Yuga. How? Because it's an astronomical event. It's an astronomical event where 7 heavenly bodies were in conjunction in the Mesha Rasi. And that was the beginning of Kali Yuga. And that's an astronomical event that can be dated. You can go back, look at the configuration, and you can get the precise date, and that is the date and time you will get. This is non-negotiable. Kali Yuga is non-negotiable. 3102 is Kali Yuga, the beginning of Kali Yuga, and we started a calendar there called the Kali Saka. You open a Panchanga, it will tell you 2025, which is the ADBC calendar. And below that you will find Vikram Samvat, 2081, or whatever the number is. Then Salivahana Saka. So it gives you 4 representations for 2025. And so that's what we're going through. So Kali Saka, you will find in the Panchanga, you will find Vikram Samvat in the Panchanga, you will find Salivahana Saka in the Panchanga. So after the Kali era, the third one is Jayabhyadaya Yudhishthira Saka. What is that? This is 1 year after Kali Yuga. So 1 year after Kali Yuga is when Vedavyasa started writing the Mahabharata. Now he was an eyewitness to the war. And so he was writing the Mahabharata and he started that in 1 Kali era. And for that, they started a year, it did not become popular, so they merged it back into Kali Yuga. But you will find some inscriptions that refer to Jayabhyadaya Yudhishthira Saka. So this is academic, so it's included here. But there are 2 inscriptions of Janamejaya using this Saka. And that's why I list this here. 3076 BC has a number of names. Most important name, Yudhishthira Kala Saka. That is the year of the Swargarohana of Yudhishthira. That is why it is Yudhishthira Kala Saka. The Swargarohana of Yudhishthira, or the Saptarishi Saka. Laukika Abda, Lokakala, Kashmir Abda. Kashmir Abda because it was a calendar for the people of Kashmir, and that is used even today in Kashmir, the Saptarishi era. So this is one of our Sakas. Then we have Malavagana Saka, which is a breakaway group that started their own calendar. That was 725 BC. Then Persian synchronism, 550 BC, is Cyrus Saka. This is a Persian king. A Persian king, and he becomes important, and we'll see why. But I just want to say that that is an important era for us to include in this list. Sri Harsha Saka, 457 BC. Now this is important. Sri Harsha Vikramaditya. Why is it important? His father was Chandra Sarma. Chandra Sarma was a guru, a scholar, who marries the princess of Ujjain. He is a Brahmin, he is not a Kshatriya, and he is not of a royal lineage, but he marries the princess of Ujjain, and he has two other wives. He has a Brahmin wife, and I think he has a Vaishya wife, and they have 4 children. And those 4 children are Bhartrihari from the Brahmin wife, Bhatta, Vikramaditya, and Vararachi. These are the 4 children he had, and then he becomes a sannyasi, and he becomes Govind Bhagavatpada, who is the guru of Adi Shankara. And that's why Sri Harsha becomes important, because he is a contemporary of Adi Shankara, right? So Sri Harsha, 457 BC. Then you have the Gupta era, 327, which the Brits moved to 4th century AD. Then you have the Vikram Samvat, 57 BC. You have the Salivahana Saka, which is 78 AD. Now I do have some notes on the right. Okay, the Cyrus era. Now, the note I have on the right is that the Cyrus era of 550 BC was used by 2 Indian astronomers, Vruddhagarga and Varahamihira. Excellent astronomers who have written texts on astronomy. They actually use the Cyrus era in some of their slokas. So it was known in India, and so that's why Panditji felt that this is something that must be included. And the last one, of course, is Salivahana Saka. And the Buddhist and Jain texts also have a Yudhishthira Saka, but their Yudhishthira Saka is not the same as ours. Their Yudhishthira Saka begins in 468 Kali. That is the beginning of their Yudhishthira Saka. So this is important to know, or we'll make mistakes in translating dates. And the last one, of course, is Salivahana Saka, which is 78 AD. Next slide, please. Al-Biruni, I'm just trying to show that Al-Biruni also corroborates some of these. So what did he corroborate? He visited India in 1031, and he identifies 3 eras that were in use. He identifies the Kali era, dates match, 3101. Sri Harsha era, 457, matches. Vikram era, 57 BC, the date matches. So this is corroboration. So part of triangulation. And you've got the same eras from a Persian source. Next slide, please. Saka has 2 meanings. The first meaning is it applied to a country, Sakasthana. So meaning the place of the Sakas. Then the name changed. Then it changed to refer to the people of the country. So Sakas means those people. And then it changed to the king of the Sakas, meaning the king of Persia. Now Saka was a tribe. There was a tribe of Kshatriya kings who stopped practicing Vedic rituals. And they were ostracized and they were driven out of the country. And then they migrated, and there were a number of tribes, but there was one tribe in particular called the Parasakas, and the Parasakas moved to what is today called Iran. So these people moved to Iran and settled in Iran, and they became anti-Hindu. So you will find that they worshipped our asuras and they demonized our gods. So they were the opposite of Hinduism. So you look at Zoroastrianism, and you will find, yes, they worship fire, yes, they worship Mitra and Agni and Indra, but then they worship all demons, and then they denigrate Hindu gods. because they were driven out of India. That is the hatred. So anyhow, so Saka means Persian now. When you say a Saka, you're talking about a Persian king, not any king. It is a Persian king. Now, the second meaning is Kala, era, epoch. Now, the point is this became slightly redundant because the distorters of the East India Company used this only for Shalivana Saka. They did not use it for any other. So the question is, why? Why? Why don't you use it for others? So that's why. But the point is, to be academic, yes, it does have two meanings. So the question is, when you're reading a sloka, you have to interpret it correctly as to which meaning is implied. So the Rudragarga uses second Repakala, meaning the time of the Persian king. So it's completely spelled out. Rudragarga, era of the Saka king. Varaha Mihira says Sakabhupa Kala or Sakendra Kala. Bhattotpala, who wrote commentaries on the Brihat Samhita, uses second Repakala and so on. I'm just trying to show references that Sakakala was known in India. Astronomers have used this. And so if astronomers have used this, then what is the Sakakala they are talking about? We have to find the date of that. Right? Next slide, please. Oh, I missed one point. Yes, the last point, Kalidasa wrote a book, a treatise on astronomy. Kalidasa wrote a book on astronomy called Jyotirvidhavarana. And in Jyotirvidhavarana, he mentions whoever kills Sakas in large numbers, says, will become a Sakakaraka and will become a Chakravarti, an emperor, and a new era will be created in his name. Kalidasa writes this in Jyotirvidhavarana, and he identifies 6 Chakravartis in Kali Yuga. And he says 3 exist or 2 exist, 4 are yet to come. And he says the only 2 that exist were Yudhishthira and Vikramaditya, and the 4 that are yet to come are Salivahana and 3 others. So this is already predicted by Kalidasa. Next slide, please. All right, so here the example is 550. We're talking about Cyrus the Great, Persian king whose son was Darius. Darius actually invaded India. He had satrapas in the northwest part of India. So just as a reference. So that's the point. Now, I think you can skip this. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we've given all that as background, let's apply these. So what these two tables show, the table on the left is the order of the Sakas as they should be. This is the correct order. The table on the right is what the British distorted it to. So what is in our textbooks is what is on the right. The table on the right is what we will find in our textbooks. The corrected one is on the left. So I've tried to use color for easy mapping. So if you look at the Gupta Saka, 327 BC, the British moved it to 4th century AD at the bottom of the tables. Now, they didn't change this, but they changed the date from 3138 to 1931, Yudhishthira Saka. So the date of the Mahabharata war, they moved from 3138 to 1931. Kali era, they moved to 1895. So these dates were changed, but this one, the ones in color, this was removed completely. The Manava, if you look at the entry in green, the Manavagana Saka, 725 BC, they merged into Vikrama Saka, 57 BC. That's what the British did. Then they removed the Sairishira completely. The Sri Harsha Vikramaditya era of 457 BC was moved to the Sri Harsha era, 6th century, 606 AD. So this is basically the problem that needs to be solved. So the one on the right is the problem, the one on the left is the solution. So just wanted to show you this. Next slide, please. Okay, sheet anchor. How do you establish the date of the Mahabharata war? We have 3 sets of evidence. You have the internal evidence in the text itself. You have astronomical evidence, and you've got inscriptional evidence. So what do you have in terms of internal evidence? It says Vyasa was an eyewitness to the war, and he was the author of Mahabharata. And he began writing the book in one Kali, the Jayabhyudaya Yudhishthira Saka. And he says that Yudhishthira ruled for 36 years after the war, and then Kali Yuga began. So if you know Kali Yuga at 36, then you've got the date of the Mahabharata war. This is internal evidence. Vyasa's Sabda Pramana, and who better than an eyewitness to the war? Yeah, so that's internal evidence. Astronomical evidence. You have the Saptarishi Mandala. The Saptarishi Mandala, actually, let's go to the Saptarishi Mandala. Can you next slide, please? Okay, what is the Saptarishi Mandala? You have these, you have the Jyotish Chakra. Right? The Jyotish Chakra is in the Bhuvarloka. The Bhuloka, and then you have the Bhuvarloka. In the Bhuvarloka, you have all the stellar and planetary bodies. And there, that's what you see in the night sky, these constellations. And so in that night sky, if you imagine that as a circle, that's 360 degrees, right? You have 12 rasis. So 12 rasis in 360 degrees is 30 degrees per rasi, right? But you have 27 nakshatras. So you can put 27 nakshatras also in 360 degrees. And you'll find that one rasi has slightly more than 2 nakshatras, right? So that's the constellation. And then you have the Saptarishi Mandala, which moves independently. The Saptarishi Mandala moves in not clockwise, but it moves anti-clockwise. It moves in retrograde motion. And in moving in the retrograde motion, it stays in each nakshatra for 100 years. So that's the Saptarishi Mandala. And that is used to measure larger time spans. It is also used to validate other numbers. So it completes one revolution of the Jyotish Chakra in Adhe Saptarishi Mandala. దానికి అఫ్ కోర్స్ మీకు అరుంధతి వశిష్ఠ నక్షత్రం తెలుసు కదా, అది సప్తరిషి మండలం. ఆ సప్తరిషి మండలం రెట్రోగ్రేడ్ మోషన్లో తిరుగుతూ ఉంటుంది. సో ఒక్కొక్క నక్షత్రంలో 100 ఏళ్ళు ఉంటుంది. సో ఒక జ్యోతిష్ చక్రం పూర్తిగా కవర్ చేయడానికి 2700 సంవత్సరాలు పడుతుంది సప్తరిషి మండలం. సో మీకు లార్జ్ టైమ్ స్పాన్స్ మెజర్ చేయడానికి కానీ వ్యాలిడేట్ చేసుకోవడానికి కానీ వాడుకోవచ్చు సప్తరిషి మండలం. ఎగ్జాంపుల్స్ ఉన్నాయి కింద. మత్స్యపురాణ శ్లోకంలో, మత్స్యపురాణంలో, వాయు పురాణంలో ఇది డిస్క్రైబ్ చేసింది డీటెయిల్డ్గా. అండ్ మోస్ట్ డీటెయిల్డ్ ఎక్స్ప్లెనేషన్ ఉన్నది కలియుగ రాజవృత్తాంత గ్రంథంలో. ఈ సప్తరిషి మండల మూవ్మెంట్ చాలా డీటెయిల్డ్గా ఎక్స్ప్లెయిన్ చేశారు. సో మత్స్యపురాణ శ్లోక ఎగ్జాంపుల్స్ ఉన్నాయి ఇక్కడ. పరీక్షితుడు జన్మించిన దగ్గర నుంచి మహాపద్మానంద పట్టాభిషేకం వరకు 1500 ఏళ్ళు గడిచాయిట. అంటే 15 నక్షత్రాలు దాటికి వెళ్ళింది సప్తరిషి మండల. నక్షత్రానికి 100 ఏళ్ళు కదా, 1500 ఏళ్ళు అంటే 15 నక్షత్రాలు దాటాలి. సో ఆ రకంగా మీకు లార్జ్ టైమ్ స్పాన్స్ మీరు మెషర్ చేయొచ్చు, లేదా ఉన్న డేటాని ఈ రకంగా వ్యాలిడేట్ చేసుకోవచ్చు. సో ఇది ఎగ్జాంపుల్. సో ప్రీవియస్ స్లైడ్. సో ఇది వాంటెడ్ టు ఎక్స్ప్లెయిన్. సో ప్రీవియస్ స్లైడ్లో ఏమిటంటే ఆ సప్తరిషి మండల ధర్మరాజు రాజసూయ యాగం చేసి చక్రవర్తి అయిన రోజు అది ఇట్ మూవ్ మఘా నక్షత్రానికి వచ్చింది. సప్తరిషి మండల వచ్చి 100 ఏళ్ళు ఉండాలి. ఆ 100 ఏళ్ళు ఎప్పుడు పూర్తయ్యాయి? 3076. సప్తరిషి మండలం ఎప్పుడు మఘ దాటి ఆశ్లేష నక్షత్రానికి మూవ్ అయింది. అండ్ ధర్మరాజు స్వర్గారోహణ అదే ఏడాది జరిగింది. అది 3076. అది యుధిష్ఠిర కాలశక ఆర్ లౌకిక ఆబ్ద, కశ్మీర్ ఆబ్ద ఇందాక చూసాం. సో ఇవి 100 years. సో ఇది వ్యాలిడేట్ చేసుకోవడానికి ఇంకొక పద్ధతి. అండ్ దిస్ ఇస్ బేస్డ్ ఆన్ ఆస్ట్రోనామికల్ ఎవిడెన్స్. దెన్ వరాహమిహిర, ఇందాక పేర్లు చెప్పాము. వాళ్ళు రాసిన శ్లోకం ఏమిటి? వాళ్ళు ఏమన్నారంటే వృద్ధగర్ వరాహమిహిర ఉన్నది ఇన్ 57 BC, అంటే విక్రమార్కు టైంలో ఆయన ఉండేవారు. వాళ్ళకి నవరత్నాలు ఉండేవి. ఆయన దీంట్లో నవరత్నాల్లో కాళిదాసు వరాహమిహిర ఉండేవారు. సో వరాహమిహిర బృహత్ సంహిత రాసినప్పుడు ఆయన అందులో హీఈస్ కోటింగ్ వృద్ధగర్గ. దట్ వృద్ధగర్గ ఇలా రాశారు, ఐ కంప్లీట్లీ అగ్రీ అని చెప్పి రాశారు. దీన్ని తీసుకుని కల్హణ రాజతరంగిణిలో ఈ సార్ వరాహమిహిర ఇలా రాశారు, ఐ అగ్రీ విధేయం అని చెప్పి ఆయన రాశారు. అక్కడ ఉంది సైరస్ హీరా రెఫరెన్స్. సైరస్
ఇలా రెఫరెన్స్ అందులో ఉంది. అందులో కల్హనా అగ్రీస్, రుద్రగర్గ అగ్రీస్ అండ్ వరాహమిహిర అగ్రీస్. సో అది మనకి తెలియదని అనడానికి లేదు. బికాస్ 3 very intelligent astronomers, great astronomers are using that either in their sloka. Okay, ఆ శ్లోకం ఏమిటి? ఆయన ఏమంటారంటే ఈ సప్తఋషి మండల ద్వాపరయుగం అయ్యి కలియుగం మొదలైన టైంలో హస్తినాపురంలో ధర్మరాజు పరిపాలించేవాడు అని మొదటి శ్లోకం, విచ్ ఇస్ కరెక్ట్. దెన్ ఆ డేట్ ఏమిస్తారు? ఈసారి ఇప్పుడు ఉన్న శకకాలకి 2526 జోడిస్తే ధర్మరాజు స్వర్గారోహణ తెలుస్తుంది. సో ధర్మరాజు స్వర్గారోహణ 3076 అయితే అందులోంచి మీరు 2526 మినహాయిస్తే you get 550 BC, which is the date of the Sairasida. Okay, so ఇందులో ఉంది కిటుకు. సో ఇది ఇగ్నోర్ చేస్తే your date should be wrong. You have to reconcile this. రుద్రగర్గ అన్న మాట వరాహమిహిర బలపరుస్తూ ఉంటే దాన్ని కోట్ చేస్తూ మన కల్హన కూడా అది కోట్ చేసి ఒక డేట్ రాశాడు ఆయన. సో ఈ శకకాల యూ హ్యావ్ టు ఫైండ్ అవుట్ వాట్ ఇట్ ఈస్. అండ్ పండిత్ జీ సేస్ దిస్ ఇస్ 550 BC. అది మారితే మీ డేట్స్ అన్నీ మారిపోతాయి అండ్ your chronology becomes wrong. అది ప్రాబ్లం. ఓకే, సరే. దెన్ ఇన్స్క్రిప్షన్ ఎవిడెన్స్ అంటే ఎగ్జాంపుల్స్ ఉన్నాయి ఇక్కడ. జనమేజయ ఇన్స్క్రిప్షన్స్ ఇందాక చెప్పాం కదా, అది ఉంది యూజింగ్ జయాభ్యుదయ డేట్. దెన్ కింగ్ సుధన్వ ఆదిశంకర్లకి ఆయన ఫెలిసిటేట్ చేసింది ఇప్పుడు ఆదిశంకర్ నిర్యాణం సంవత్సరం చేశారు 477 BC. సో దట్ ఈస్ అనదర్ డేట్ టు. అండ్ అది ఏమిటి? యుధిష్ఠిర శకలో ఉంది డేట్, కాపర్ ప్లేట్ మీద డేట్ యుధిష్ఠిర శకలో రాసింది. సో అది ఇంకొక కరాబరేట్ చేయడానికి పాయింట్. అలాగే చాలా ఉన్నాయి ఇక్కడ. జస్ట్ ఎగ్జాంపుల్స్ ఇచ్చారు. వీఆర్ నాట్ లుకింగ్ ఓన్లీ ఎట్ వన్ type of evidence. We are looking at internal evidence, astronomical evidence, as well as inscriptional evidence. Next slide, please. So, okay, so on a sheet anchor established అయిపోయింది. Mahabharata war 31-38. Now what? పురాణాల్లో చూస్తే వాళ్ళు all the dates are యుధిష్ఠిర శక, అంటే మహాభారత యుద్ధానికి ఇన్ని సంవత్సరాలకి జరిగింది అని రాసి ఉన్నాయి. సో ఆ డేట్ తెలిస్తే all the other dates are correct కదా. So now next slide. So, okay, that is the methodology. Now, applying all that, what do the Puranas say? Now, మనం bold kingdoms ఉండేవి, మనం అన్ని కన్సిడర్ చేయక్కర్లేదు. అయోధ్య we don't have to consider. We don't have to consider హస్తినాపురం ఇంకో 100 years తర్వాత అయిపోయింది. There was no Hastinapur 100 years after the Mahabharata war. But long-lived kingdoms చూస్తే longest-lived kingdom is Magadha. Magadha history తీసుకుంటే మీకు గుప్తా డైనస్టీ వరకు అన్నీ వచ్చేస్తాయి. ఇందులో డేట్స్తో సహా అన్నీ ఇచ్చాను మీకు. సో ముందు ఈ డైనస్టీస్, ఆ డైనస్టీలో ఎంతమంది రాజులు ఉండేవాళ్ళు, వాళ్ళు ఎన్ని సంవత్సరాలు ఇది రూల్ చేశారు, అండ్ ఆ డేట్స్ ఏమిటి, మొత్తం ఈ టేబుల్లో ఉంది మీకు సమరీ. ఈ డీటెయిల్స్ యూ కెన్ ఫైండ్ ఇన్ ఎనీ ఆఫ్ ది పురాణాస్. బ్రహ్మాండ పురాణ, భగవత్ పురాణ, విష్ణు, వాయు పురాణ, అన్నిట్లో యూ హ్యావ్ ది సేమ్ ఇన్ఫర్మేషన్. ఓకే, ఇందులో వన్ థింగ్ ఐ డూ వాంట్ టు పాయింట్ అవుట్. మౌర్యకి గుప్తాకి కన్ఫ్యూజన్ ఉంది బికాస్ ఆఫ్ వాట్ విలియం జోన్స్ డిడ్ కదా. సో చంద్రగుప్త ఇద్దరు ఉన్నారు, మౌర్య డైనస్టీలో ఒకడు, గుప్తా డైనస్టీలో ఒకడు. సో వాటి గురించి కొంచెం డీటెయిల్స్ తెలుసుకుంటే మనకి ఇట్ ఇస్ పాసిబుల్ వీ కెన్ ఐడెంటిఫై విచ్ ఇస్ విచ్. ఒక మేజర్ డిఫరెన్స్ ఏమిటంటే మౌర్య డైనస్టీ వాళ్ళ రాజధాని గిరివ్రజ ఆర్ రాజగృహ, ఈ రెండు పేర్లు వాడుతూ ఉండేవారు. ఇది మగధ ఎంపైర్కి రాజధాని. ఎప్పటి వరకు? ఆంధ్ర శాతవాహనాల వరకు అదే క్యాపిటల్. ఇది వచ్చి ఆ గుప్తరాజులు మార్చారు. గుప్తరాజులు మూవ్డ్ ఇట్ టు పాటలీపుత్ర. సో మీకు ఎక్కడైనా పాటలీపుత్ర కనిపించింది అంటే అది గుప్తా డైనస్టీ అయ్యి ఉండాలి. ఇట్ కెనాట్ బి బిఫోర్ ది గుప్తా డైనస్టీ. సో దట్స్ అనదర్ వే టు కొరాబరేట్. నెక్స్ట్ స్లైడ్ ప్లీజ్. ఓకే, సో ఇలాగా ఇప్పుడు దీస్ ఆర్ ది కింగ్డమ్స్ దట్ ఎగ్జిస్టెడ్ అట్ ది టైమ్ ఆఫ్ ది మహాభారత వార్. సో మీకు ఫస్ట్ రోలో వీళ్ళందరూ యుధిష్ఠిరు ధర్మరాజుకి సమకాలికులు, ఫస్ట్ రో. సో ఇలాగా చేస్తూ ఆ ఎల్లో దీంట్లో షేడ్ చేసింది. ఐఎమ్ ట్రైంగ్ టు షో యూ బుద్ధ. బుద్ధ బిలాంగ్ టు ది ఇక్ష్వాకు డైనస్టీ, which is Ayodhya. So from the Mahabharata war, if you look at the Ayodhya list of kings, you will find Siddhartha as the 23rd king. And Siddhartha is the contemporary of Magadha kings, Ksemaji, Bimbisara, Ajatasattu, వీళ్ళకి contemporary. So ఇది, of course, the details next slide లో ఉన్నాయి. Next slide. 1887 అండి. 1887 birth and Nirvana is 1807 BC. So 80 ఏళ్ళు. So next slide please. So ఇది ఆయన పుస్తకం నుంచి I'm trying to show you one sample. This is how he actually extracted information from the Puranas and corroborated so that you can see the Magadha dynasty, the Nepal and Kashmir dynasty side by side. And you can see the contemporaries of all the kings, who were contemporaries to whom. And this he has done from 3138 to 1193. So all this is available in his books. Next slide, please. So the date of Buddha. Date of Buddha was, well, I just have the first 2 or 3 just to make a point. The first one is there is a Buddhist tomb in Greece, and that is dated 1000 BC. So Buddha must have lived before 1000 BC, right? So you cannot consider a date after 1000 BC. If you have the tomb of a Buddhist monk with 1000 BC, Buddha could not have been born after 1000 BC. So this is basically to throw out all the later dates. So now, Nagarjuna was spreading Buddhism in Kashmir. When? In the 13th. Nagarjuna is about 1294 to 1234, 13th century BC. 13th century BC. Correct. 13th century BC. Correct. So, 13th century, then you don't have to look at dates after the 13th century. If Nagarjuna was spreading Buddhism in the 13th century, Buddha could not have been born after. It had to be before the 13th century. So these I just put out just to have this conversation. But if you look at the real date from the Mahabharata war, you look at the Ikshvaku dynasty, you will find the 22nd, 23rd, 24th things are Shuddhodana, Siddhartha, Rahula. Dates don't lie. If the Mahabharata war happened in 3138, then Buddha was in 1887. Right? This is non-negotiable. He is the contemporary of Ksemaji, Bimbisara, Ajatasattu. Now, at the coronation of Ajatasattu, 1814, Buddha was 72. This is from the history of Magadha. They are corroborating. So you're saying Ajatasattu was coronated in 1814 BC and Buddha was 72 years old. Then Buddhist texts say his nirvana happened in 1807 BC when he was 80 years old. So the point is, I would think Buddhist texts would be authoritative when it comes to the birth of Buddha. Yes, sir. క్రైస్ట్ కన్నా 19 శతాబ్దాల ముందు పుట్టినవాడు బుద్ధుడు. 19 శతాబ్దాలు 1900 years ముందు పుట్టింది బుద్ధ. అంటే అది క్రీస్తు తర్వాత పుట్టినతనా లేకపోతే ముందు పుట్టినతనా చెప్పడానికి BCAD వాడతాం. అవును, 3000 సంవత్సరాల ముందు జరిగింది. ఎస్, మనకి మన ఎవిడెన్స్ ఏమిటి, వాళ్ళు ఒప్పించడం ఇస్ నాట్ ది ఇంపార్టెంట్ థింగ్. ముందు నిజం ఏమిటి మనం తెలుసుకోగలిగితే దెన్ వాళ్ళు మన ఎవిడెన్స్ అడిగినట్టు వాళ్ళు కూడా ఎవిడెన్స్ మనం అడగచ్చు. సో సో ఆర్బిటరీగా ఫిక్స్ చేశారు. దీనికి ఏమిటి ఎవిడెన్స్, ఆధారాలు ఏమిటి చెప్పి మనం అడగచ్చు. ఏది ఎవిడెన్స్ ఇది? Where is the no. See, what applies to me, you should apply to you also. Where is the evidence? Okay, ante saripodu. Where is the evidence? Show me the evidence. No. It applies to them also. If they want to make an assertion, we have a right to ask them the same question. Show me the evidence. ఆధారాలు ఉన్నప్పుడు రండి మాట్లాడదాం. Alright? Okay. All right, I think we're running out of time, so I'll quickly wrap up. So basically, this is the data available in our own texts about Buddha and Buddhist texts. So, next slide, please. Okay, Adi Shankara. Adi Shankara, Max Miller puts Adi Shankara in 788 AD. And Panditji says, no, he was born in 509 BC. So now, how do we know? What says the evidence? Adi Shankara had many disciples, and there were 10 disciples who wrote his biography. They were all called Shankara Vijaya. Now, of those 10 biographies, the one that is considered most authoritative is the one called Brihat Shankara Vijaya. Brihat Shankara Vijaya was written by his childhood friend Vishnu Sharma, who becomes his disciple. Vishnu Sharma, after taking sannyasa, becomes known as Chitsukacharya. So Chitsukacharya's Brihat Shankara Vijaya is the most authoritative biography of Adi Shankara. And what does he say? He says he was born in Kali 2593. 2593 years after the Kali Yuga began, Nandana Nama Samvatsaram Vaishaka Sukla Panchami is the birth date of Adi Shankara. And that is 509 BC. Right? That is 509 BC. Then you have all the other dates. See, the Dwaraka, Kanchi and Puri Mathas all agree on 509 BC. Only Singari does not agree. Then of course is Upanayanam when he goes to Govinda Bhagavad-pada, when he goes to Gaudapadacharya. All these are here. Then Jina Vijaya. Everybody heard of Mandana Mishra? Who is his guru? Who is Mandana Mishra's guru? Kumarila Bhatta. Kumarila Bhatta is the guru of Mandana Mishra. So when Adi Shankara studies with Gaudapadacharya, Gaudapadacharya says, I have taught you everything I can. Start writing bhashyams and get them peer-reviewed by Kumarila Bhatta. So he goes looking for Kumarila Bhatta and he finds him self-immolating. And he says, I am in no condition to debate you. Why don't you go to Mandana Mishra and debate him instead? So that tells you that Kumarila Bhatta was the contemporary of Adi Shankara. And so was Mandana Mishra. But when did this happen? And why was Kumarila Bhatta self-immolating? That was his prayaschitta. No, he joined Jainism. He became the student of Mahavir Jain, the 24th Tirthankara. He became the student of Mahavir Jain. And that was cheating. And he was caught. So the other disciples threw him down from the top of the house of their teacher. And of course he lost one eye in that thing. And then he was self-immolating as a prayaschitta. That is when Adi Shankara met him. So Adi Shankara is now the contemporary of Mahavir Jain. So you can get corroboration from Jain texts. So Jina Vijaya becomes a reference. Jina Vijaya says Adi Shankara meets Kumarila Bhatta in 493 BC. And so on and so forth. So Nepal Rajavamsavali is from the Nepal Rajavamsavali also identifies when Adi Shankara visited Nepal. Rajatarangini talks about when Gopaditya was actually building temples in honor of Adi Shankara. And so with these dates, there is no way Adi Shankara could have been born in 788 AD. Right? Now, where did 788 AD come from? 788 AD comes from a book called Shankara Mandara Saurabha. This is And in that, that is the story of a great Shankaracharya of Kanchi. And in the stories that they wrote, everything that he does and says sounds exactly like Adi Shankara. So a lot of people mistook him for Adi Shankara. But that was actually Abhinava Shankara, the 38th Guru of Kanchi, who was born in 788 AD. And it is Max Miller's mischief that made this the date for Adi Shankara. So I just wanted to clarify this. These are the evidences we have in text form that refute 788 AD as the date of Adi Shankara, and the correct date is 509 BC. Next slide, please. Vikramaditya. Now, Vikramaditya, I told you, Vikramaditya Salivahana were removed from history. 1300 years was removed from history. Panditji did some research and says, what do we have? The Bhavishya Mahapurana talks about the Agnivamsa dynasties. And it says, 3000 years after the beginning of Kali was when Vikramaditya was born. That is 101 BC. Vikramaditya was born. And then 82 BC is when he becomes the king at Ujjain. But then he becomes a Chakravarti. And he becomes a Chakravarti by including Nepal into his empire. So he appoints Amsuvarman. He appoints Amsuvarman as his Samantaraja in Nepal. And that's when the empire is complete and he becomes a Chakravarti. That happened in 57 BC, and that is the beginning of Vikram Samvat. Vikram Samvat begins after Vikramaditya becomes the Chakravarti. And the final act of becoming the Chakravarti is the inclusion of Nepal by appointing Amsuvarman. And now, that is the Bhavishya Mahapurana and the Nepal Rajavamsavali that we get this data from. You look at Kalidasa's Jyotirvidhaparana. The English have confused us. They said there are so many Vikramaदिtyas and so many Kalidasas, which is not true. Now, this Kalidasa, in Jyotirvidhaparana, he says this book is dedicated to my emperor, Vikramaditya. So he is identified as emperor. He said, I am Kalidasa, the author of Raghuhamsa and Jyotirvidhaparana. So there cannot be any ambiguity as to which Kalidasa we are talking about, right? And he says the Navaratnas in Vikramaditya's court, he gives all 9 names. One of them is Varahamihira. So with that one book, you place Vikramaditya with Kalidasa with Varahamihira. They are all together in the 1st century BC. But you look at Wikipedia, it says Varahamihira existed in 505 AD. So that's one of the distortions we still have to correct. But this tells you he was in the 1st century BC. Then I have more evidence, so I'll skip that. But I think I made the point that he does become a Chakravarti. He has a calendar named after him, and so he's a real person. Next slide, please. Now, Salivahana is the great-grandson of Vikramaditya. So, between the two, between 57 BC and 78 AD, Ujjain broke up into smaller kingdoms. And then Salivahana reunites them in 78 AD. And becomes a Chakravarti again. He does the Ashwamedha Yaga, becomes a Chakravarti, and they start a new calendar in his name. And the table on the right are the 6 Chakravartis that Kalidasa had mentioned. I just put them in that table. So the 2 who have already gone by, 3 from today that have gone by, Yudhishthira, Vikramaditya, Salivahana, and the last 3 are yet to come. This is still in the future, so that's good. Next slide, please. So, Vikramaditya versus Vikramaditya. Because a lot of people, because of the distortions, they pushed the Guptas into 4th century AD, and they said Gupta, the Chandragupta Empire had a title of Vikramaditya, so they confused him with Vikramaditya of 57 BC. So we're saying, okay, they are 2 different people. So this table provides the comparison and says, of the Gupta dynasty, his title was Vikramaditya, not his name. But Ujjain, the name was Vikramaditya and the title was Harsha. First difference. Anyway, I'm trying to show the capital of the Guptas was Pataliputra, capital of Vikramaditya, real Vikramaditya was Ujjain. So these are the, Panditji actually provides this table in his book, so you can compare and that way you can distinguish who is who. Next slide, please. Okay, Yuga Purana. And I told you about forging. They actually wrote a text called Yuga Purana. And in Yuga Purana, they are showing distortions, showing that the Greeks were conquering parts of India. And it's a forgery. And this is his criticism about that text. He says, number one, it was discovered in the 19th century. Nobody heard of it before the 19th century. Right? This was not known. Number two, there are only two copies. There are only two copies of this text. Number three, it's fragmentary. I told you about the Panchalakshanas of a Purana. It does not have them. So can this be called a Purana or an Upapurana? It cannot, because it doesn't have any of those five characteristics. Number three, this text is in Prakrit. Now, they said the Yuga Purana is part of Garga Samhita. Now, Vriddhagarga was an excellent scholar and wrote perfect Sanskrit. But this text is in Pali and Prakrit. Right? So anyway, you go down that list. These are his Panditji's objections. And he says this is a fraud. It's a forgery. He says this is not a true document. So that's his conclusion. Next slide, please. I think we can skip this. Next slide. Okay, Rao Bahadur P.V. Gane, Balagangadhar Tilak wrote a book called The Arctic Home of the Aryans. He said the Aryans came from the North Pole. And Panditji wrote a book rebutting that. And that book is still in manuscript form. I have to publish it. It's in Telugu. It is called Arya Dhruvanivasa Khandanamu. And so this is a rebuttal against Balagangadhar Tilak's book called Arctic Home of the Aryans. So this is one of the books I plan to publish after I finish the English books. Aryula Dhruvanivasa Khandanamu. R.C. Majumdar and so on. And then, of course, the last bullet is he decided to retire in 1959 or 1957, and then he gave all his research. He gave his research to K.D. Setna to continue. K.D. Setna used to work in the Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry and was the editor of a magazine called Mother India. So, and Setna actually wrote one book or two books that extended the research a little bit. And so I just wanted to put this here for completeness. So next slide, please. Yeah, I think we're done. Thank you. Thank you so much.